Hey, good morning and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And whether you're starting your day or ending your evening, we are so happy that you could be part of our very first seminar. My name is Hannah, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you to the launch of the MAIDS-GRID Talk Expert Research Seminar. Before we start, I would like to thank everyone who registered for today's session, and we're happy to see such strong interest in this talk, and we're very grateful that you have chosen to join this dialogue. This is a new initiative conceived and managed by our PhD students and fully supported by the MAIDS-GRID International Development Studies Program at the Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University here in Bangkok, Thailand. Our goal is to provide a dedicated space for experts to share insight on the multifaceted issues within development studies. As this is a monthly series, we are already looking forward to our future session with our next speaker and date to be announced very shortly. To kick off the series, we are diving into a high-stakes investigation titled Nature Crimes, as you can see on the screen, the convergence of criminal economies in the Mekong region. The Mekong, specifically the three-border Golden Triangle of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, has become a global hub where environmental exploitation and criminal activity converge. These activities collectively generate billions of dollars annually for transnational enterprises. And today, we will examine how these nature crimes, the illegal extraction and trade of natural resources, are deeply embedded within broader illicit economies, with a particular focus on the complex landscape of post-coup Myanmar. To lead this discussion, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Kevin Woods as our inaugural speaker. We are particularly excited because today's talk anchors itself in his brand new publication. So Dr. Kevin Woods is a political ecologist and political geographer who received graduate degrees from Yale University and UC Berkeley. He investigates the politics of land and resource extractivism, forest conservation, and armed conflict in Myanmar's borderlands using mixed method approaches that combine ethnographic fieldwork with remote sensing analysis. His research is grounded in long-term collaborative partnerships with indigenous civil society organizations, where he co-designs and conducts field-based research in local languages. Dr. Kevin has published widely in top journals on political ecologies of war and revolution, developing concepts such as ceasefire capitalism, conservation as counterinsurgency, and greening territoriality. Along with his co-editors, Dr. Kevin published a book titled Turning Land into Capital, Development and Dispossession in the Mekong Region with University of Washington Press, and he's currently finishing his second book with Yale University Press titled The Fifth Cut, War and the Remaking of Nature in Myanmar. He has led policy engagement on resource conflicts and environmental peace building in Myanmar's ethnic territories with Forest Trends, the state's Institute of Peace, and donor-funded programs in Myanmar, and regularly briefs government agencies, diplomats, and NGOs. He has also been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and National Geographic, as well as regional media outlets. Dr. Kevin served as a fellow at the East West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, and a research associate at Chulalongkorn University's Faculty of Political Science, Center for Social Development Studies in Bangkok, Thailand. Just a quick word of how we will be spending our time together before I turn things over to Dr. Kevin. So we will start with a 60-minute presentation and set aside 30 minutes of moderated discussions. Or we can have a freestyle discussions later on, depends on the speaker and also the engagement of the participants. Okay, so with that, Dr. Kevin, it is a pleasure to have you today, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Hannah, for helping to organize this and very generous introduction. I'm sorry to everyone that it was so long for getting through my bio. And also just thanks to your program for sponsoring me and allowing me to start off this great research seminar program that you started. It was really good to hear. And thanks to all the participants for joining. Um, I hope that you know, enjoy the topic, and I really look forward to discussion and question and answer afterwards because this is the first time that I have the opportunity to talk about this report that just came out, which I'll talk about in just a second. Um, so. Also, because I don't know who's joining us, I will say, due to the somewhat sensitive topic that I'm speaking about, if there are any journalists joining us, which I hope there are, I am gonna have to ask not to use any of this material in your writing unless you consult with me first. Let's set up an interview and kind of do it that way, just so that I can kind of make sure that things aren't attributed to me in ways that would not be appreciated given the topic I'm talking about. Okay, so I just wanted to get that out of the way. Um, some of the things I'm going to talk about, I think I'm just seeing some names on here that the empirics that I have to share with you today are probably not going to be terribly surprising, but what I'm hoping is helpful for those who are already very familiar with the narrative that I'm talking about today. It's like the way that I'm trying to conceptualize it and piecing together a different narrative arc. Hopefully that is helpful, and for those that are less familiar with the topic today. Like, I'm also really excited for you to geek out with us on lots of data findings. So, as many of you, I'm assuming know, by especially for those that are in the region, there's been an explosion of attention on financial scam centers, right? And online fraud in the Mekong region. The Golden Triangle's cyber scam industry now generates one estimate is nearly $40 billion a year. UNODC, think tanks, they've published many reports on this issue. Journalists have been doing a great job covering it, but less so by researchers. Most of that work treats scam centers and casino capitalism as if they appeared out of nowhere, as if criminal syndicates simply discovered a new technology and just like moved in. So what I have found what is largely missing from that literature, this is like mostly the gray literature and journalism, is the question of what we could call historical formation. How did these criminal enterprises come to be? What were the past and present conditions that led to a $40 billion fraud industry operating out of the borderlands of Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia? Like how did that come about? And that's what motivates this talk. Um, I think what I have come to answer this question is to argue that we have to go back to nature crimes to understand this narrative. Nature crimes here is defined as illegal logging, mining, and wildlife trafficking. And we have to take into account the illicit drugs economy that preceded and underwrote these nature crimes. Nature crimes were not separate phenomenon from state expansion into ethnic borderlands. I argue that they were a part and parcel of it. The extension of the Myanmar military's reach into Kachin State, into Shan, Karen, Karenni territories, and analogous processes in Laos and Cambodia, which has their own context, of course, was financially organized around the extraction of natural resources and the taxing or direct management of drug production. Oftentimes, especially in Myanmar, pro-government militias manage these operations within and beyond their territories under political strongmen um, uh, with arrangements with the government. The borderlands were not ungoverned spaces where crime happened to flourish. This is the common misconception that underpins much of the development discourse as well as a lot of journalism. In fact, they have been and continue to be actively governed through crime by states that found strongmen and illicit economies they operated in as useful instruments of territorial control.
Dr.
So that's
Kevin,
kind of,
sorry to
yeah,
interrupt. So one participant noticed that the slides are not advancing. Is that intentional or?
we are still on the title slide,
Okay, cool.
but I appreciate that someone was concerned how long we've been on the title slide. I will remind you that I am talking for a full 1 hour.
Sure.
Which is for any of you, which I think most of you have given PowerPoint presentations before, 1 hour is a really long time.
Okay.
So
Got it. Thank you so much.
patient, patience. There's only 12 slides and a lot of me just constantly talking. But I like that someone's trying to hold me accountable. That's good. So understanding scam centers and casinos requires understanding what came before them. The criminal economies that built the infrastructure, the networks, the protection rackets, and the political arrangements that these newer enterprises simply repurposed. So this talk, as I briefly mentioned already, comes from a report recently published with, along with my inputs from my colleague Art Blundell, under Forest Trends publication with the same title as my talk today, Nature Crimes: The Convergence of Criminal Economies in the Mekong Region. And this tries to put nature crimes back at the center of the story and trace the threads that connect resource extraction to the full spectrum of illicit economies operating in the region today. Okay, see? Now we finally have gotten to slide 2. So, um, I am going to spend probably a considerable amount of time kind of conceptualizing all of this. It's also because I didn't know who was joining, what is the background knowledge of people joining, and I want to make sure that people aren't left behind in the story that we're talking about. So this is both like historicizing as also kind of doing some conceptual work before we get to the empirics. The relationship between natural resources and political violence in Myanmar is not a recent phenomenon, and I would argue definitely not incidental. It is structural, built into the political economy of the country since even going back to the colonial period. So, like the British teak economy in Myanmar, for example, was organized around the extraction of forest resources from territories that were actually never fully incorporated into the British colony in Myanmar. The forest was valuable in part not just because of the trees for the British sailing boats to continue conquering the world, but also because it was located in these upland frontier zones, specifically in Karen areas. And these territories that required military pacification to exploit. That logic from colonial times have not disappeared. And it was inherited and extended by successive Burmese governments. They use, for example, resource concessions as instruments for projecting their state power. This is post-colonial, yeah, into ethnic territories that they could not control by force alone. And that kind of history, I have written quite a lot about. I can't stop talking about it because I think it's so important to understand that legacy. So then by the time of Ne Win's military government and then into the SLORC and SPDC military era, a fairly consistent pattern had emerged. The Myanmar military would broker arrangements with ethnic armed organizations or EAOs and their leaders, ceasefire agreements, special administrative zones, or militia status. And in exchange for standing down militarily, they were granted the right to legally exploit natural resources in their territories: timber, minerals, gems, and eventually drugs. This arrangement, which I have previously labeled as ceasefire capitalism, um, in which armed groups turned into businesses with armies extracting and exporting resources under military protection, um, quickly became not only the conduit of war, but I would argue in the war itself, which is what my next book, forthcoming book, is arguing as well. So the key point here is that the ethnic armed strongmen who came to define the Golden Triangle, I'm thinking here, the usual characters that are talked about: Lo Sing-hang, Kun Sa, UWSA leadership, particularly in the 80s and 90s, among others, of course. They did not operate outside the state. They are operated through the state. Lo Singhang's company, Asia World, now operated by his son, they built roads all over the place, often connected to dams and resource concessions, and they built a large part of the new of Naypyidaw, the new capital. The state's own conglomerates, the Union of Myanmar Economic Holdings, UMHL, um, state-owned enterprises, they hold monopolies, right, on the extraction and trade of many of the natural resources found in Myanmar and are exempt from commercial taxes. So this is not a story of state failing to stop crime. It is a story of the state organizing crime for its own financial benefit and as a way to manage the world's longest ongoing civil war. This pattern is very Myanmar specific, but it's not only a Myanmar story. So in Laos, the government's expansion into the northern borderlands followed similar logics as I just explained. Resource concessions to Chinese investors and local strongmen as instruments of state territorial incorporation. I'm thinking especially here Michael Dwyer, John Bing Gao, Juliet Liu, Keith Barney. In Cambodia under Hun Sen, the concession economy served analogous functions. The CPP using land and forest grants, for example, to reward loyalty and extend political reach into peripheral areas. Sarah Milne, Philippe Lebion have written a lot about this, and other countries in the region, they have a similar story. So when we talk about nature crimes in the Mekong region today, we are not talking about a breakdown of governance. We are talking about a particular form of governance, one in which resource extraction and political violence have always been co-constitutive. So that historical foundation is what makes the 2021 coup situation in Myanmar, since the coup in 2021, so impactful. The coup did not create the political economy. It removed whatever constraints existed on it and handed it to actors with even fewer incentives toward accountability. And that has been the situation up until right now. At least I would argue. Oops, I think there we go. Okay, so so that's kind of some background there. So just for everyone to make sure we're all on the same page. So now I want to do some kind of, before we go into the empirics, to do some conceptual work. And this is going to run through the entire talk. But before, actually, I don't want you to see that slide. I want to use the chatbot function. I've actually never done this on a Zoom call before, so hopefully it'll work. Um, for those so inclined and inspired, I want you to write in the chat box one word or phrase of when you read the term or think of the term illegal logging or nature crime in a NGO report or a news media article, who do you picture as the perpetrator? What is the image that you think of? Can you write it in the chat box? Don't overthink this. Of course, my friend Peter Rossett would say the state. Thank you, Peter. hmm Anyone else want to contribute before we go on? Okay, great. Those are even more on point than I was necessarily expecting. So I I think you already got my idea. Okay, so I'm done. My presentation's over. You guys understand all of this already. Yes, so I'm working with a very smart and sophisticated crowd at Chulalongkorn. I appreciate that. Um, so, in the context of Myanmar, especially post-coup Myanmar, and really the rest of the region, the question of who has the legitimate authority to define what is legal and what is illegal is really contested if we think about this, right? So I'm going to just quickly offer three kind of cuts to understand this issue. The first one being on fragmented sovereignty. Since the coup, Myanmar has no single legitimate governing authority. You could even maybe argue that was the case before the coup as well, but it's certainly much more stark since the coup. The SAC junta controls some territory. The NUG claims to be the legitimate government in exile with a bit of territory. Ethnic armed organizations or EAOs govern large swaths of the borderlands under their own administrative systems. So, like for example, when the KIO grants a mining license in Kachin State, that license, perhaps not surprisingly, would be considered illegal under SAC law or policy. But is it therefore a crime? And if so, like according to whose rule of law? The KIO would say that it is exercising their legitimate governance of its own territory. The junta would say that it is criminal extraction. Or what about the leaders of the UWSA or the Kokang militia? Like the point here is that the illegal is not a neutral technical category. It is a political claim made by one governing authority against another. Okay, the second take that I want to point out is involves understanding how the state itself is not a neutral arbiter of legality. I would argue it's an active perpetrator. So the UN fact-finding mission documented how the Myanmar military committed crimes against humanity. This very well publicized. The junta extracts jade, timber, and gas, among other resources, to fund a military that is engaged in ethnic and religious cleansing. When we describe the junta's resource extraction as official and EAO extraction as illegal, we are, whether we intend to or not, are essentially lending a certain legitimacy to the authority of the perpetrator state who's defining these terms. So we have to be very cognizant and critical and careful about these terms. The third and final point is about how legality functions as a weapon against the weak while protecting the powerful. So historically in Myanmar, illegal logging charges were applied to ethnic villagers, oftentimes. I should actually just villagers. It was regardless of their ethnicity. Villagers cutting trees for subsistence, or in ethnic territories targeting EAOs who are funding their resistance, while military-linked cronies ran industrial-scale extraction with impunity. Environmental defenders, many of them are from indigenous communities, have been prosecuted under state laws that were never applied to the businesses destroying the ecosystems they were defending. And everyone who posted in the chat was like totally on point with what I just said. So I'm happy to hear that that we're already far more advanced than what my talk is going through right now. When we use the language of crime and illegality in this context, we need to be really explicit about whose authority we are invoking and like what political work that language is doing. So, with given all of that, I want to be really clear what I mean and what I do not mean when I use this term nature crime. I am not referring to ethnic armed organizations like the KNU, the KIO, and others whose resource extractions occurs within territories they administer under governance frameworks they have developed over several decades and under conditions of active armed resistance to a military state that has committed crimes against humanities against these populations. Their extraction raises important questions. I'm talking about the EAOs. EAO's extraction raises important questions, however, about accountability and environmental standards, which I'm going to get to later at the end of my talk. But it is categorically different from what I'm describing as nature crime here. So, what I am referring to with nature crime are actors who have explicit political arrangements with the Myanmar military state. So, these arrangements that grant them resource extraction rights in exchange for counter-revolutionary services or political loyalty. I'm thinking here the Kachin Border Guard Force, or BGF for Border Guard Force. So the Kachin BGF under Sakon Tingyang that um, got mostly dismantled 2 years ago. They were operating rare earth mining concessions worth over $1 billion annually under junta patronage, selling those concessions to Chinese companies in direct violation of Myanmar's own laws. The Kachin BGF, I'm sorry, the Karen BGF, which partnered with the Chinese fugitive investor to build casino and scam infrastructure in Shui-Gogo, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, using illegal gaming profits. Or the Kokang BGF in Laokai. They ran casino complexes and scam centers under military protection as well. There's other militia groups in northern Shan State, Pansay militia, the Gangka militia that reportedly operate drug refineries and resource extraction concessions. Um, Actually, I'm going to say reportedly the drug refineries, and I have direct evidence of them running resource extraction concessions as franchises of the military's counter-revolutionary economy. Right? So these are the actors at the center of my analysis in this report and my talk today. And what makes their extraction criminal is not simply that it lacks a government permit, it is that the revenues flow to networks of violence that is against indigenous peoples and their self-determination. It bypasses communities entirely and is organized through corruption and coercion than any other form of accountable governance. Okay, just to move this very quickly, there's four commodity categories that I look at: timber, minerals and gems, wildlife, and natural gas. I'm not going to go through each detail now. I'll do the empirics on this in a few slides. But let me just flag two things first. The first one being about scale. Environmental crimes, according to one estimate, costs at least 1 trillion US dollars per year globally when you account for the long-term ecosystem damage, not just the immediate market value of what was extracted. 1 trillion per year. In Myanmar alone, officially reported natural resources, the trade of natural resources since the coup has exceeded 30 billion dollars, according to official numbers. And that's a significant undercount, of course, which I'll get to in a second. The second and last point for this slide, and more important for our purposes, these commodity sectors are not separate environmental problems. You have to understand, even though that might be logical to many people on the call today, the people who work in development assistance and kind of um, conflict and uh, security studies that is not as critical as my approach. This is a new emerging understanding that these nature crimes are the financial foundation and operational infrastructure of broader criminal enterprises. The people I just referred to, kind of more in development sector, security sector, they think of nature crimes as only an environmental issue, and therefore they kind of push it aside because they don't think that that matters. And what I'm trying to argue is like these nature crimes provide the seed capital, territorial control, and networks that enable expansion into drugs, cyber fraud, money laundering. Those things, those sectors deeply care about in everything that these institutes work on. So they should be thought of as a single integrated political economy. Each one feeds the others, and then all of them feed this like broader criminal enterprises, drugs, casinos, scam centers, that have attracted like all of this attention and what led to this report. So this is not just some unimportant, thing that the environmental activists talk about. Like this is so central um, to security, regional security, to peace, and all of these other issues that I think many people that are joining us today work on. So the 2021 coup did not create the criminal economy, right? That we recognize that. But what it did was remove some constraints, regulatory, institutional, reputational, and kind of hand that apparatus to actors that have no incentives towards accountability. Um, the immediate effects in retrospect are quite obvious. The Myanmar Jat collapsed. The formal banking system has seized up because of sanctions. SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, lost access to international financial infrastructure as a result of these sanctions. The junta, facing a legitimacy crisis and an armed resistance that they have not been successful in suppressing, became suddenly dramatically more dependent on natural resource revenues and illicit economies to fund its operations, more than before the coup. And at the same time, the multiplying anti-coup armed resistance forces that emerged after the coup and the existing EAOs who have been here for decades, they faced exactly the same resource pressure from the other direction. They also needed more revenue to fight. And the fastest money available is usually in the ground. So the result is this double dynamic that makes this moment so analytically distinctive. You have the junta and the resistance forces are extracting and trading natural resources to raise revenues that are so much more in need since the coup, and they're often competing over the same territory and the same resources. So it's really getting complicated with legality and accountability. Okay, you can see this table here, it's pretty small, and I apologize, but hopefully you can make out most of those numbers. The trends are, I think, are always more important. If you want to look at that table better, you can download the report. Just type in Nature Crimes Kevin Woods or Nature Crimes. Not that I'm doing the Nature Crimes author Kevin Woods, Nature Crimes Forest Treads, and it's very easy to find the report and then a search engine. Um, so since the coup, importing countries have reported more than 30.5 billion US dollars in natural resource imports from Myanmar. That's the official figure, meaning that's what trading partners are willing to put in their customs data. When I say trading partners, I'm referring to countries, right? But we can all understand that the actual flows are actually much. Thank you, Hannah, for putting the link in the chat. Are much higher. We know this because there's like huge systematic discrepancies between what Myanmar's own government agencies report what they're exporting and what importing countries actually report. And these huge gaps are consistent with large-scale smuggling. Um, a few specific figures that I think I should point out. Myanmar has now overtaken Afghanistan as the world's largest opium producer. That happened about 2 years ago. Um, Rare earth element exports have reached 1.5 billion US dollars in 2023 alone, according to Chinese customs data, and that was up from $811 million in 2021. That's practically a doubling in just 2 years, and that is being driven, excuse me, by Chinese demand for inputs to renewable energy supply chains. 75,000 people or so are estimated to be living and working in just the Golden Triangle, SEZ, on the Lao border. Most of them are involved in scamming or casino operations, and that's not taking into account all the other casinos and scam centers and all the workers in them. Um, the caveat that matters is that official natural resource trade represents only about 5% of Myanmar's GDP, but it counts for about a third of their official national export value. That gap between GDP share and export share tells us this is an economy organized around extraction for export, not domestic development. If it was about domestic development, you would see a much higher GDP that resources are accounting towards. The illicit component, the jade that never goes to the emporium, the timber that crosses the border at night, the rare earths that bypass these government checkpoints is exponentially larger than what these official data sets are saying here. So, what I want to point out with this slide is like kind of the organizing logic that runs through everything else that I'm talking about today. The reason why studying nature crimes in isolation, or drug trafficking in isolation, or scam centers in isolation, it misrepresents what is actually happening within these criminal spaces. Criminal organizations in the Mekong do not specialize. They diversify. And they diversify in quite a particular way, not necessarily by building new infrastructure for each new criminal enterprise they enter, but by repurposing existing infrastructure. The network comes first and then the commodity. So the logging and mining roads cut through Kachin State and Shan State in the 1990s to log trees and to mine jade and gems, for example, became then the smuggling routes for heroin and methamphetamine across the Chinese border. The border crossings regularized for the timber trade became the same crossings used for trafficking wildlife parts. The protection rackets built with local officials to move timber were the same relationships that were later activated to move drugs, and later still to move trafficked workers into scam compounds. So these financial networks established to launder timber revenues, running through Myanmar's private banks, through Chinese trading companies in Yunnan, through real estate in Mandalay and Yangon. These became the networks used to launder drug money and now cryptocurrency from cyber fraud. This is why this $40 billion cyber scam industry did not require criminal organizations to start from scratch. They converted casino buildings into scam compounds. They repurposed drug transport corridors to move trafficked labor. They adapted financial networks originally built for laundering timber and mining proceeds to now handle cryptocurrency transactions. The technology has been changing, but like this underlying infrastructure and social network is already there, and they're still using it. So this integrated network structure has a direct implication for how we think about enforcement. Um, I want another entertaining chat exercise. So if you were advising a government or international body trying to disrupt these criminal networks, where would you focus enforcement pressure? If you were like head of an enforcement agency, how would you go about enforcement given how I just conceptualized this like convergence? Does anyone want to write a few words in the chat box? Hmm. Oh, we had four participants. Last question. Oh, I got one. Oh, two. Okay, here they come. Phew. Okay, financial compliance, banking services, cutting off arms sales too, and these are great. You guys are you guys are too smart for my talk, I'm telling you. Those are great answers. Those are great. Um, yeah, and I'm really excited to see the financial part of it, and of course the arms. Yeah. Um, let me transboundary governance. You see this on the slide, balloon effect problem. I'm not sure how well that concept is known outside of security studies. So let me share that idea because I think it works really well here. So this balloon effect is a well-documented phenomenon in drug enforcement specifically. That's where this idea comes from. If you squeeze the balloon in one place, it expands somewhere else. So it applies with equal force across this full spectrum of criminal economies that we're discussing today. So when Beijing, for example, pressured Laos and Cambodia to crack down on casino operations there, the investment suddenly surged in post-coup Myanmar, where enforcement had collapsed. When Operation 1027 in northern Myanmar and Chinese pressure closed down those scam centers on the China border, operations migrated to Tachilek and Myawaddy on the Thailand border. When international sanctions made it harder to export sanctioned timber through former channels, trade rerouted through Yunnan registered front companies. So the criminal economy does not shrink under pressure, it just relocates and adapts. And that has always been a big problem for kind of the enforcement part of this. But the bigger implication that I think the policy literature has been really slow to absorb is that if you shut down a casino, the criminal organization running it does not retire, right? Unless they're like locked in jail, which rarely happens. Um, it intensifies, the criminal syndicate intensifies resource extraction or drug production, usually, to compensate for the lost revenue from, let's say, a shutdown casino or scam center. So if you sanction a timber company, to think of this differently, the logging continues, it just like moves to a different export route and a different buyer. So enforcement that targets a single commodity or a single sector can be actively counterproductive if it pushes criminal revenues back into nature crimes. And this was also, an impetus for this report with this really big concern. If there is more effective enforcement of these financial scam centers, I'm really worried what that's going to mean for drug production and trade and nature crimes. Um, and these nature crimes and the drug economy tend to have the most severe and irreversible environmental and community repercussions. So this would not be a good effect. The implication, of course, is that effective responses have to target the shared infrastructure, and your great answers got a lot to this. The financial networks, the protection relationships, the border crossing arrangements, rather than chasing individual commodity flows, even though, what I'm saying, is much harder and more politically demanding task. I am not, for many reasons, working in an enforcement agency. I recognize the challenge, but at the same time, there needs to be a more holistic approach. Um, so this whole idea of golden triangle, which I'm not going to try to deconstruct now, um, this idea of the golden triangle describes a specific governance condition, I would argue. It's a tri-border zone where the jurisdictional reach of these three national states kind of thins out, and where natural resources are relatively abundant, or at least in some, it used to be in some places, and where non-state armed groups, or at least in Myanmar, have operated autonomous territories for decades with explicit or tacit state permission to do so. Um, don't want to get into this history as much as I thought I would. Um, okay, so very quickly, like the Burmese Communist Party fell in '89. These several different armed groups came out of that, particularly the UWSA, the NDAA, and the MNDAA. They had arrangements with the military at that time um, to basically, in exchange for standing down with their ceasefires that they signed immediately upon exiting the Communist Party, they were effectively licensed to run their territories as they saw fit, which included running drugs, casinos, resource extraction, um, and I just want to say that they didn't become criminal enterprises despite the state. They entered this criminal economy because of the state, as a deliberate instrument of state border governance, which is still operating very robustly today. These are not Chinese organizations in the normal sense. They are ethnic armed organizations, WA, Shan, and Kokang, UWSA, NDAA, MNDAA, WA, Shan, Kokang, that emerged, several decades ago now. But they are Sino-Burmese in their political and commercial orientation in important ways. So, for one, the Kokang, they are ethnically Han Chinese. They're Mandarin speaking. They have deep cross-border family and business networks in Yunnan. UWSA, NDAA, their leadership has a long-standing commercial relationships also with Chinese business networks on both sides of the border. What links these organizations to Chinese criminal organizations is not just ethnicity, but specific transactional relationships, joint ventures in casinos, drug manufacturing arrangements, where Chinese entrepreneurs oftentimes provide capital and precursor chemicals. And then the local armed groups provide territory and protection for those investments. Wildlife trafficking networks where Chinese buyers work through local intermediaries, scam center operators where ethnic Chinese criminal syndicates provide the technology and some of the laborers, while armed groups provide the compound and the security and some of the capital as well. So ethnic Chinese criminal organizations are the dominant transnational actors in this space. But I also want to flag that there are some important distinctions. Chinese involvement, of course, is not monolithic. It spans from like the legitimate, legal, state-linked investment. This is particularly for oil and gas, but also formal infrastructure deals, thinking BRI in this instance. But it also involves what we can call like gray market capital, where Chinese entrepreneurs operate in kind of regulatory ambiguity, which is not really clear. What is the legality of what's happening? Parts could be legal, parts illegal. And then there's just like outright criminal operations run by sanctioned individuals, such as like Zhao Wei at the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone on the Lao border, for example. So Beijing's enforcement uh, posturing reflects this kind of complex landscape I'm painting. China has real interest in curbing criminal activity that targets its own citizens. They have so clearly demonstrated this. And that's because the scam centers have generated an enormous amount of political pressure for Beijing. But it also has interest, right, in maintaining these like relationships with Mekong country governments and also a lot of different armed group leaders whose cooperation it needs for border stability, for infrastructure access, rare earth supply chains. So the result is like this kind of selective, episodic enforcement. It's kind of performative, but sometimes effective, rather than any sort of like systematic across the board, effective pressure. Um, okay, I'm going to give you some numbers because sometimes people like that. It's summarized there in the table for you. Um, the headline, well, let's see. Okay, so natural gas, $13.7 billion dollars. This is, as you can see from the label for the table, this is 2021 to 2024. Unfortunately, I do not yet have 2025 data, so I cannot go up till last year. But so like the 3 years after the coup, this is what is being reported by importing countries. That's important. So natural gas is always at the top, and this is despite sanctions because the infrastructure is fixed, and Thailand is the main buyer and has not walked away. Um, Jade and Gems, $6.4 billion dollars. Um, that figure is heavily front-loaded. Its imports soared to $4.2 billion dollars in 2022 and then collapsed to just 180 million by 2024. And that reflects this like chaotic redistribution of territorial control after the coup, not from some underlying change in demand. Rare earths, again, this is official according to importing countries. Rare earth, $3.6 billion, which is driven almost entirely by Chinese demand for green energy and weapons supply chains. Tin, 3.1 billion, and then forest products and copper make up the rest. And so that's how we get the $30.5 billion in total since 2021 or from 2021 to 2024. And that's just what importing countries are willing to officially put on their customs data. Now, we can all understand that the actual flows would be much larger. And I think one figure illustrates that better than any other. Before the coup, Myanmar's Extractive Industries Transparency Body, which was called MEITI, they reported zero income from rare earth mining, zero, despite Myanmar supplying roughly a third of global demand, which was worth $780 million a year in exports to China at the time of MEITI's last report, which is in 2017 to 2018. Okay, so that's $780 million in 2017 and 2018, but then it went down to zero. Um, which meant that the entire sector was operating outside any official framework under the control of a single militia group, formerly the Kachin BGF, selling these concessions to Chinese companies. So please keep that in mind with these figures. It is severely underrepresentative of the true scale of extraction. I just want to hit points that are most important for the argument in these different sectors. The report goes in much further in details for each one of those. Drugs, Myanmar, I already said is like the world's largest producer of opium. Um, I'm just realizing what the time is right now, so I'm gonna go faster through these last slides. Um, One thing I want to point out is, mining sites oftentimes run brothels. I know this is very dark and awful, but it's the reality. And they often push drugs on the workers, both the people working in the brothels as well as the mining laborers. Poppy harvest cycle and the wildlife poaching period in the dry season align almost perfectly, being not overlapping, but the poppy harvest cycle ends and then the wildlife trafficking season starts. And it reflects that the same criminal networks are rotating through these seasonal opportunities with the same labor and the same logistics. Casinos, I mean, Shan State alone has like about 60 unregulated casinos. That's insane. Just before the coup, NLD tried to kind of clamp down or apply pressure on Shui Gogo in Karen State. And then on the same day as the coup, on February 1st, 2021, the Karen BGF who runs it announced on social media that Shui Gogo was fully operational again and was like hosting parties. That's interesting. It's like really well illustrates this close relationship between criminal operations and the military state. Scam centers, um, these drug corridors started actually moving trafficked workers into these scam centers. Mining financial networks started handling cryptocurrency. So this criminal network was already there. It just found like a much more lucrative application during COVID than the coup. And then running through all of these is money laundering, right? So the military regime's whitening tax that they had for banks that are owned by several former drug lords, the state's natural resource auction bids for timber and jade, crypto and offshore accounts today. It got so absurd that Myanmar was blacklisted by the International Watchdog Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, in 2022. That's a really major deal. It really says just how comprehensively the financial oversight system in Myanmar has completely collapsed. Um, I wonder what else. It's so important to me, the last three slides that I have, because I don't want to end on such like a heavy, oppressive, feeling hopeless topic. So I'm just going to say these things are very self-reinforcing. You know, you can see in my notes on this slide how like nature crimes fund armed groups. They erode governance, and eroding governance erodes livelihoods. Eroding livelihoods has a tendency for farmers to start growing poppy. More poppy means more crime, and it's just like this awful downward spiral, which unfortunately like Myanmar is in right now. And that has real like human security and human well-being dimensions. Um, yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that because I want to take the next like 5 or so minutes to. It might seem, well, I think given the audience, you'll understand why I want to shift to this. But it is a very different, it's a definite pivot to this topic of nature crimes. Um, but I think it's really important and under-examined in light of talking about like scam centers, for example. Um, So oftentimes, like I said at the beginning of my talk, there's this like idea of this governance vacuum in Myanmar's ethnic borderlands, or that only transnational criminal organizations encompass these borderlands, or that ethnic armed organizations are themselves the criminal organizations, um, by themselves operating these criminal economies. So that could be the case in some of these territories. But I really want to push back on that common misconception, because it implies these territories are totally ungoverned or ungovernable, don't even have the possibility to be governed. And it also that assumes that the state is not involved in these crimes. So, as many as you probably know who are familiar with these geographies, these border zones in Myanmar, especially where Burma, Laos, and China come together, are differently governed in these various mosaic of geographies. So the KIO, for example, has administrated Kachin territory, Kachin land for decades. They run schools, health posts, taxation systems, courts. They govern agricultural land and forests. And they have their own respective KIO departments for each one of these sectors. KNU has done the same in Karen areas in Gautule. That is generally well known. So these are functioning sub-state administrative systems with widespread legitimacy among the populations they serve in these areas. I will say it's also, kind of understood and accepted that these various departments are also very under-resourced. They're insufficiently equipped to govern at their full capacity over such huge territories. So they need more adequately trained human resources and support to best ensure these ethnic governance systems are made more accountable, more transparent, generally community-centered, more equitable. And, the future political settlement in Myanmar, one way or another, is going to be some form of federal arrangement. And this will then require that ethnic governing authorities demonstrate that they can manage land and resources in ways that serve their populations rather than just like simply reproducing this extractive logic of the military state, but just wearing a different uniform. The international community, donors, researchers, like all of us in this room, we have a role in supporting that capacity building. Um, One really good example is KIO's takeover of rare earth mining operations in Chipway in about a year and a half ago. Um, they pushed out the Kachin BGF, which had been running those concessions as like this personal kind of fiefdom under junta patronage. And then the KO was immediately faced with this question of what to do with the sector that's generating at least $1.5 billion a year. It's an insane amount of money. So this is not like a tiny governance question. This is like fueling the global supply of rare earth metals. Civil society organizations within Kachin have been, I'm so happy to see them so actively pressuring the KAO to develop transparent, community accountable frameworks for that revenue, rather than just simply having all of that money just absorbed into KIO's budget or just going into leaders' pockets. Um, and whether they succeed in making that more transparent and accountable and equitable is a big open question. But I am really happy to see that that debate is happening, and that's really significant within the Kachin context. The KNU, they have developed land and natural resource policies that explicitly recognize community land and forest rights and they require lots of things, including consultation and a host of other equitable measures before extraction. You can see the picture of their land policy, for example. Um, and then they've been really actively engaging with international forest governance frameworks, and this represents like a real serious engagement with that has positioned ethnic governance as a legitimate political body in um, these global environmental policy fora. Um, that is a very different claim than simply like administering a mining concession, because this is now we're talking about sovereignty, self-determination, and international recognition for ethnic governance systems and governing bodies in these territories. Another really good example is the Karenni state federal government, the Karenni IEC. And for time reasons, I'm going to truncate this a bit, but they have also been developing a federal governing apparatus. And mining revenue is an important part of their financial base, and they're trying to consider like how do we govern land and resources so it serves our building the foundation for a federal government in Karenni state and does not keep reproducing this extractive logic that has caused so many problems for the past several decades. These outcomes are not guaranteed. Um, there is definitely a trend towards formalizing land and resource governance in these EAO territories. It is admittedly since the coup driven by revenue needs for funding the revolution, but it's also being driven by civil society pressure and by the logic of building legitimate governing institutions that are more robust and have greater capacity that then will lay the foundation of future decentralized political federalism. So it's really exciting what is going on. And we need to be focusing on that, not just the criminal economies that the rest of my presentation was talking about. So I just want to close by let's see, is there anything else that I think I think I don't need to read the rest of that slide. I think all of that has been covered in my previous points. And I went over by a few minutes, but that's not so bad. We still have a full 25 minutes for question and answer. I would love a discussion. I don't know how that it will be moderated. Um, Keep in mind, I am one of many experts that are on Zoom right now. And so I would love it if there's people better positioned in the audience to help answer a question that you also join. I only know what I know, and I don't know a whole bunch of other things. Thank you for listening to an entire hour of me rambling. I look forward to what comes next with the rest of our 25 minutes together.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kevin. You're still a very disciplined speaker, to be honest. It's just over for 5 minutes, so it's nothing. Um,
Well, if I didn't have this script, I would have been over by an extra hour. So
Thank you for being so prepared for that. Okay, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kevin. We would like to invite the participants for anyone who has thought or questions. You can just drop the questions in the chat box, or maybe can engage directly so we can have direct discussions with the speaker. I think while waiting for others, I saw Dr. Ajahn Alex also has a questions in the chat box. I'm not sure if he was referring to one specific slide, so I would like to invite him
Yes.
to. Okay, Ajahn Alex, please.
Thanks. You hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Kevin, thank you so much for this very informative and very detailed presentation, and also especially with the framing and explaining the historical formation, especially and the correlation between nature exploitation and nature crimes and modern scam figures, etc. So it's very, very helpful. I would like to ask you about the banking and money laundering actually, because it's not quite clear to me how this is actually functioning, how the money flows are functioning, the military, to the different militia, with their licenses, etc. Then I would like to ask one of the banking sector is really one question, and money laundering also, if it's necessary also. I mean, sometimes the money might not be actually being worked. Then second question would be the role of Thailand in it. I'm also very interested. So Thailand is very much affected also by human trafficking, of course, and by scamming also. They have a reason actually to act. That's a foreign minister actually here at MAIDS. And we will discuss this actually this topic also. And there's this wonderful research of Ajahn Gao that you also hinted at. And she was writing a little bit about the implication of the capitalist economy. I heard even some recently involved. So I think these in the business. So I'm very interested in that too, people in mind.
Thank you for those questions and further explanation of the topics that those questions are speaking to. For the first one, I just want to say first that I'm obviously not an expert on money laundering or banking. That's probably clear from my intro of being a political ecologist and political geographer, but I can
Yeah.
speak to that in kind of less technical terms of how that works. But as money laundering has gotten way more complicated, and especially since cryptocurrency, I completely do not understand it. But I can speak to other, I'll call it more old school money laundering. Um, and leave the cryptocurrency understanding to the younger generation to to explain of how that facilitates money laundering. But like for example, casinos, I think it's pretty helpful just to understand that casinos is not a place where you gamble. It's a place where you launder money. Um, they've always served that purpose all over the world, and this is also the case where basically the money that the gamblers are bringing in and losing, that becomes your profit. Well, anyway, I'm not going to go into all of that, but casinos are really effective at money laundering, which is why they exist. And then even most of the biggest cronies in Myanmar that were very involved in the resource economy, but also the drugs economy. They all opened up banks, private banks. Um, that was very convenient. Well, when you own a bank, that's also pretty darn easy to launder the revenue that you generated from nature crimes and from the drugs economy. The Myanmar military also established a whitening tax. Forget what year that was, maybe in the 2000s. And I think it was like something about 25% of your revenue had to be paid for the privilege of literally laundering your money, your drug money. It was like an official policy. They didn't use those words, but that was the point of it. And even like look at the major global cities in the world, London, New York, so on and so forth. People buy properties, like huge, huge properties, to also launder drug money. And I think it's also one way to understand why, like, I wouldn't be able to buy a tiny little property in like Lashio or some other town in Shan State because it is insanely expensive. And the only way to understand that is that there's enough drug money and other illicit revenue flowing through those areas of Myanmar that people want to buy property to sink that ill-gotten revenue into that. Anyway, there's a lot of methods to launder money and many more that I didn't even speak to. As the For the Thailand question, I've have been more of a scholar on Myanmar than Thailand, but um, and I'll leave it to those who specifically t study Thailand's role in it, John Pinkau and others. But I think without getting too specific, I mean, I guess two things historically, previous governments from in Bangkok have made lucrative business deals with the military junta and with various EAOs for oil, gas, timber, mining, you name it. And so they've always had a lot of vested interest in these in resource business deals across the border. Um, and as I made the argument in my presentation that these nature crimes were like the foundational bedrock for other criminal economies. So, like Thailand indirectly, or I should say, Thailand's capital indirectly has been integrated that way. Um, but then also just like the ability for Go to exist there and draw electricity uh, just like a few miles from the Thailand border. Obviously, that can't happen fully without something allowing that to happen on the Thai side. If you think about um, the whole political fallout that happened with the previous Thai government over a leaked phone call with a certain ruler in Cambodia, and then suddenly there's a war against Cambodia. People have speculated the varying degrees that these financial scam centers have played in that and Thailand's direct or indirect role. It's something that you can read more in the mediascape on these, how that is all kind of embedded within each other. Yeah. Thanks again, John, for your questions. I hope that at least got to some of the topic that you wanted addressed. Other questions?
Maybe it's a habit topic, Dr. Kevin, but I think while waiting for others, I have one question.
Hmm.
So, I used to work for Wildlife Justice Commission. It's an organization's, well, NGO, that is focusing on the, of course, nature crime. So we were focusing on three specific theme. First is wildlife products, and then illegal timber, and another one is marine crime. I was just wondering if in Myanmar specifically, if there are some organizations or NGOs to be specific, they're also working along with the either the like the big government or the organizations like local organization to disrupt the nature crime. For example, like are they equipped with the so-called intelligence analysis, and then is there any way for them to be equipped intellectually in a sense that um, the criminals is taking place in the region, but then do they have the capacities to stop it anyway, or is that just so hard to control?
I'm sorry, who has the capacity to stop it? Who are you referring to?
I would say the local local government
In Myanmar.
in Myanmar. Yes, definitely.
I think it's really hard to do anything about much of anything in Myanmar these days, for various reasons. Um, yeah, let me qualify that. I actually don't really like how that just came out. There's lots of things you can do in Myanmar, less so on this issue of nature crimes. Um, in terms of the organizations that are facilitating it, because I mean, they're standing armies with protection from SAC, and they're in their territories that you need permission to enter as a foreigner or even a Burmese person who's not from that territory. So that is pretty challenging. Um, and then it is would be extremely risky to be what I would call an environmental defender in Myanmar these days. Most of the environmental defenders before the coup have fortunately escaped and for their safety, others less lucky. Um, and in terms of organizations that are still working from within Myanmar, this would be too dangerous for them to work on. And so that is also why, I mean, I'm talking about from within Myanmar. There are certainly more things that can be done from outside Myanmar, but that is also why I ended my talk about where I find the most promise, especially by working in a local context and building from within, is trying to recognize the governing apparatuses that are existing that are trying to govern more effectively, that do have policies in place that manage land and natural resources, and at least in theory, recognize and support community rights to land and forests. And so, KAO, KNU, the Karenni, I'm just talking about the China and Thailand borders. Obviously, there's more going on than just that in the rest of the country. Like, they have an uphill battle to like govern and protect their land and natural resources, from nature crimes and these other criminal activities that are happening. But it is where the support is needed, and it's where I have been working and putting a lot of effort and advocacy on. It is getting really hard to find any funders who want to, continue trying to support that, which is such the wrong decision. Like now is more important than ever. And unfortunately, donors in the development industry, foreign governments feel the opposite. They just feel like, oh, it's a lost cause. And I'm like, it's a lost cause if you don't provide this support. And it's such a no-brainer. And then thinking about how to continue to build and support future decentralized political federalism. I think that's the best answer, and not to come from a strict security development lens. That clearly has not worked, number one. And also conceptually is just coming at this in a I would argue, a very empirically incorrect way.
Thanks for the answer, Dr. Kevin. We have another question. Do you think ASEAN's collaboration will be able to fix nature crime problems?
Yes, ASEAN. Well, I've never been one to champion ASEAN, just to be transparent. I tend to focus more working with local communities and local governing bodies and ethnic governance systems, which ASEAN is not a part of. Um, but there are various mechanisms. This is what ASEAN does, right? They have like transboundary regional mechanisms to try to address regional problems. I can't say they have been terribly effective. Transboundary air pollution is a really good case in point that this has continued to get worse, not better. Um, another good example is this financial scam centers, not effective whatsoever. And so they've never been effective on nature crimes. I've talked with many people who really believe in the mandate of ASEAN, and they can be very convincing. And I don't think it's an either or. I think yes, people who are committed to ASEAN's mandate, they should keep pushing ASEAN to be more effective in addressing these transnational regional issues. But it's obviously not the only mechanism, the only body that we should be focusing our efforts on, because it needs to come in all ways. Um, we need to be very creative in thinking about how to be more effective. ASEAN being one of them. Yeah. Mhm.
Another questions from participant as well. Groups like KIA depend on natural resources for income. How can they reduce or avoid natural resource related crimes and manage these resources more responsibly?
Thanks, Callaway, for joining and for your question. Um, well, first of all, I would not call it a crime if KIO is extracting natural resources within territory that they govern, if they are not breaking their own laws or policies. Um, Now, I haven't been able to find any policy written down by the KAO about how to govern rare earth mining. So that needs to come along. Um, but so if you take the like legality aspect out of that, then we're talking about more sustainability and more socially equitable. And there's a whole bunch of things like that's what many other places in the world have been working on for decades, and I think we should remain very critical to this concept of sustainability, and kind of making it somehow socially more acceptable. But nonetheless, I mean, there are ways to make, for example, rare earth mining less tragic than it's unfolding in Kachin State. I mean, there's proper storage of the waste that comes from rare earth mining. There's EIAs and SIAs, right? There's ensuring that the community gets a certain percentage of the benefits. I mean, Callaway, I don't have to tell you, if there was equitable distribution of natural resource revenue to Kachin communities, Kachin would be like the richest ethnic group in Asia by now, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. But I mean, it's so sad, that the people are not benefiting, and a very small number of people are. So I think the way to think about it is how can we manage this environmentally to make it lessen the environmental impact, and how can we make it more transparent and accountable of where is this resource or this revenue going, and how can the benefits be more equitably distributed?
Thanks for that. So anyone else? Okay. I guess it's Mintin too. Can I guess that you're here?
Yes. Uh, Kevin, like related to what you were just saying, good governance of EAOs and PDF, etc. You mentioned more like you took a optimistic look, looking at KIA, KNU, and currently, but like there are many other groups like in MNDAA or DNLA, and even like PDF groups and NUG. There are also some of these groups kind of show good political will in terms of using resources for the people, community, etc. But they are actually exploiting it more or less the same as the military junta. So, like, what do you think? Like, do you think it's gonna take time, or like, what else is necessary for them, for these bodies to be governed effectively in terms of natural resources? Because yeah, for me, it doesn't really look good. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Min, for that. Well, I was trying to stay focused, and there's so many armed groups in Myanmar that one cannot name even all of the categories of armed groups in Myanmar. So that's one reason I didn't talk about them, specifically the PDFs. The other reason is I share your frustration, and I I wanted to I wanted to focus more on where I think there's governing bodies that offer more hope, and possibility. It's also the places and the organizations that I've been working with as a researcher and helping with policy development and trying to improve the situation. So I just know more about that too. With PDFs, like even in my own research and what other people have been reading, there does definitely seems to be an increasing trend of resource racketeering, where basically they're doing the same thing as SAC soldiers and basically becoming armed businessmen, right? Some local PDF units and others. And this is an awful, awful development because basically that really signals um, that is a really bad signal for just how bad the governing index is in those places. And, this is, I think, related to the point that ethnic civil society um, in territories administered and governed by EAOs have been pressuring those EAO leaders on. It's like, okay, so if you're going to be directly engaged in resource extraction, even more so than in the past, then how is this different than the military and cronies and militias and BGFs doing it? And I think that is the right question to be asking. And it's a really crucial, important point we're in right now. If it's the same as SAC, then what is this revolution, is my question. And where does this go? Like that is terrifying. And what needs to happen, and I think another reason to apply pressure in these points is that these EAOs are being held somewhat accountable to ethnic civil society organizations, leaders, women's groups, so on and so forth. And it is, kind of up to them to keep applying that pressure and making sure that this isn't just another cycle, this logic of extraction and violence. And that we cast this is an opportunity to showcase what decentralized political federalism could look like. And I know from personal experience, this is what Karenni are trying to do with a valiant effort in a really challenging situation with extreme militarization and fighting in Karenni state of trying to build that governing framework. And I want to see more of that. We all do. And that's where I feel like I want to put some optimism and think of it as an opportunity rather than focus on what a mess this all looks like. So it's really important not to lose hope and keep finding geographies, governing bodies, topics that you think you can improve and put your effort there and try to stay positive. Mhm.
Thank you, Kevin.
Mhm.
Thank you, everyone. So we are coming to an end, but I would like to invite again for anyone who still have questions or thought to be inquired directly to Dr. Kevin. So we still have time, maybe extra 5 minutes or maybe just 1 minute extra. If there is none, so I think we can sign off. I guess we're coming to an end of today's session. On behalf of the MAIDS-GRID Program Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University, Thailand, thank you very much for joining and engaging actively, everyone. We also would like to thank Dr. Kevin Woods once again for the fantastic question and session as well. It was a pleasure to have such an engaging discussion to kick off the program. And thank you all for your time and your great questions. And we will see you next time. Have a good day and have a good evening.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.